In 1856 Virginia, everything about your life was decided before you ever spoke a word. Who you could marry, what your future would be, whether you were considered valuable or invisible. Society had rules for everything, and breaking them usually meant social death. Yet there was one young woman who shattered those rules without rebellion, without scandal, without doing anything at all. She simply existed. She was born into wealth, raised on a grand plantation, educated beyond most women of her time. She spoke languages, understood philosophy, and came from one of the most respected families in the region. By every standard that mattered in Southern society, she should have been highly sought after. But there was one detail Virginia could not forgive. She could not walk. They called her unmarriageable, not as an insult whispered behind closed doors, but as a verdict cold, final, and widely accepted. It didn't matter that she was intelligent. It didn't matter that she was kind or capable. It didn't matter that she came with land, money, and status. In the eyes of society, her wheelchair erased all of that. It symbolized weakness, dependence, a future that men didn't want to shoulder. And so, one by one, men came to meet her. 12 of them over 4 long years. 12 carefully arranged proposals, and 12 rejections. Some were polite. Some were cruel. But all carried the same message. She was not worth marrying. With every rejection, her future narrowed. In that world, marriage was not romance, it was survival. An unmarried woman, especially a disabled one, had no legal protection, no secure inheritance, no recognized independence. And her father knew this. He watched his daughter slowly disappear from society, not because she lacked worth, but because society refused to see it. As the years passed, fear replaced hope. Fear of what would happen to her when he was gone. Fear of a future where she would be passed between relatives like an inconvenience. Fear that love, dignity, and safety would forever be denied to her. Then, when all respectable options were exhausted, her father made a decision so radical that even speaking it aloud sounded impossible. A decision that crossed every line Virginia society had drawn: race, power, law, and morality. A choice that would shock his peers, risk his reputation, and alter the lives of 3 people forever. This is not a story about pity. It is not a story about charity or tragedy. It is a story about fear colliding with love, about power being challenged by humanity, and about a choice history was never prepared for but could not erase. Virginia in the 1850s was a land of beauty built on rigid order. Vast plantations stretched across rolling hills. Wealth was measured in acres and bodies, and society functioned by strict, unspoken rules that everyone was expected to obey. At the top stood white landowning men. Beneath them, women existed in a narrow space defined almost entirely by marriage. A woman's value was not judged by her mind, her talents, or her character, but by her ability to become a wife and mother. Marriage meant protection, legitimacy, and survival. Without it, a woman was vulnerable to poverty, to dependency, to being quietly erased. And for women with disabilities, the danger was even greater. Independence was not recognized. Inheritance laws favored men. An unmarried woman, especially one who could not walk, had almost no legal or social standing of her own. This is the world Eleanor Whitmore was born into. She came from privilege most could only imagine. Her family owned thousands of acres of fertile land, dozens of buildings, and a respected name that carried weight throughout Virginia's planter class. She was raised in a grand house filled with books, tutors, and expectations. From a young age, Eleanor was educated far beyond what was considered necessary for women of her time. She learned languages, mathematics, philosophy skills meant to make her desirable to the right kind of husband. Her future, as everyone assumed, was secure. Until one accident changed everything. When Eleanor lost the use of her legs as a child, society quietly rewrote her destiny. What had once been seen as refinement became irrelevant. What mattered now was what she could no longer do. As Eleanor grew older, the contrast between her privilege and her isolation became painfully clear. While other young women attended social gatherings, dances, and courtships, Eleanor remained at home, watching life unfold without her. The wheelchair did more than limit her movement. It became a symbol that society used to strip her of possibility. Men did not see her education, her intelligence, or her capability. They saw inconvenience, risk, embarrassment, and one by one, they refused her. Each rejection wasn't just personal. It was a reminder that without a husband, Eleanor had no guaranteed future. When her father died, the estate would not be hers. She would depend entirely on the mercy of relatives who saw her as a burden. At the center of this story is a father watching time run out. Colonel Richard Whitmore was not cruel nor careless. He loved his daughter deeply, but he lived within a system that gave him few acceptable options. He understood the brutal reality Eleanor faced far better than she did. As proposal after proposal failed, his fear grew sharper. Not fear of scandal, but fear of what would happen to his daughter in a world that had already decided she was unworthy. He was desperate to protect her in a society that refused to do so. And that desperation led him to consider a solution so extreme, so forbidden that it would challenge everything Virginia believed about race, power, love, and worth. What follows is not the tragedy society expected, but a transformation no one could have imagined. Eleanor Whitmore's childhood began the way Southern society approved of. She was born into comfort, into certainty. The Whitmore estate was vast, orderly, and respected, and from the moment she could speak, Eleanor was treated not as fragile, but as promising. Her father saw intelligence in her early and encouraged it. While other girls learned only what was necessary to become agreeable wives, Eleanor was taught to think. She read books most women never touched. She learned languages, debated ideas, and understood numbers well enough to manage accounts before she was a teenager. In her father's mind, she was being shaped into something rare, a woman whose mind would make her valuable in marriage. Then, at 8 years old, everything ended in a single moment. The riding accident was not dramatic in the way tragedies are often imagined. There was no grand spectacle, no long warning. A startled horse, a fall, a sharp, terrible pain. Doctors came from the cities, serious men with confident voices and empty promises. They examined her spine, whispered among themselves, and delivered a verdict that would follow Eleanor for the rest of her life. She would not walk again. Maybe some sensation would return, maybe some movement, but never enough to be considered whole by society's standards. The wheelchair her father commissioned was finally made, polished, expensive. But no amount of craftsmanship could disguise what it represented. From that day forward, Eleanor was no longer simply a girl. She was a problem. At first, nothing seemed different. Lessons continued. Tutors came and went. Eleanor's mind remained sharp, curious, alive. But as the years passed, the separation between her and the rest of the world became impossible to ignore. Other girls grew into womanhood through dances, visits, and courtships. Eleanor grew into it through windows and books. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations grew awkward. Pity replaced interest. The wheelchair followed her into every room, and with it came a silent judgment no one spoke aloud, but everyone agreed upon. By the time Eleanor reached marriageable age, society had already decided who she was. When her father began arranging proposals, it was not romance he was offering, but security. The first rejection stung, but it felt temporary. The second was harder. By the third, Eleanor began to understand a pattern. Men would arrive curious, even polite. They would speak with her father, compliment her education, admire the estate. Then they would look at her chair, and something in their expression would close. Conversations would end early. Private discussions would follow, and her father would return alone. Each rejection carried a slightly different excuse, but they all meant the same thing. She would be a burden. She would be embarrassing in public. She would complicate a man's life rather than enhance it. Some men were careful with their words. Others were not. Eleanor learned how to smile while being dismissed. She learned how to listen to people talk about her future as if she were not in the room. With every refusal, something essential was taken from her. Not just hope, but legitimacy. What hurt most was not that men didn't love her. It was that they never tried. Education, once her greatest strength, became irrelevant. Intelligence could not compensate for a body society deemed defective. Her accomplishments were reframed as curiosities, not assets. Very impressive, they would say, before adding, but that single word erased everything she was. Eleanor began to understand that in this world, a woman's worth was measured almost entirely by what her body could provide: grace, fertility, visibility. And when rumors began to spread, whispers that her injury meant she could not bear children, the verdict became final. No doctor confirmed it. No evidence supported it. But facts did not matter. Once society decided Eleanor might be infertile, she became untouchable. Marriage without heirs was considered pointless, dangerous, shameful. And so the rejections grew faster, colder, more decisive. 12 men in 4 years. 12 reminders that no matter how intelligent, kind, or capable she was, she would never be enough. By then, Eleanor felt the walls closing in. She could see her future narrowing with terrifying clarity. An unmarried woman, disabled, legally dependent. When her father died, the estate would not pass to her. She would belong to whoever inherited next. Her life would be reduced to charity, obligation, and quiet dismissal. And worst of all, no amount of effort could change it. Society had already made its judgment. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman with a future. She was a problem waiting to be managed. Colonel Richard Whitmore had spent his life believing in order. He believed in tradition, in law, in the quiet power of respectability. He had inherited the Whitmore estate from his own father and expanded it carefully, methodically, ensuring that the family name remained strong within Virginia's planter class. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man shaped by his time. He understood how the world worked, and for most of his life, that understanding had served him well, until it failed him where it mattered most: his daughter. Richard loved Eleanor in the only way he knew how, through preparation. After his wife died days after Eleanor's birth, he poured his grief into raising his daughter with discipline and purpose. He gave her an education that bordered on radical for a woman of the South, not out of rebellion, but strategy. An intelligent daughter, he believed, would attract a better husband. A better husband meant security. And security, to Richard Whitmore, was the highest form of love. When Eleanor's accident took her ability to walk, he told himself it was not the end. He adapted the house. He brought in tutors. He spared no expense. What he could not adapt was society. As the years passed and proposals failed one after another, Richard's confidence began to fracture. He watched men evaluate his daughter like a flawed investment. He heard the same excuses dressed up in polite language, and every rejection felt like an accusation, not just against Eleanor, but against him. He had failed in his most basic duty as a father, ensuring his child's future. At night, alone in his study, he began to think about death. Not in fear for himself, but in terror of what his absence would mean for Eleanor. Virginia law offered him no comfort. An unmarried woman could not independently inherit a large estate. Even if Eleanor were named in his will, male relatives could contest it easily. The law favored sons, brothers, nephews, never daughters who stood alone, especially not daughters who were disabled. Richard knew exactly who would inherit after him: a distant male cousin with little affection for Eleanor and even less patience. He could already see the outcome: the estate sold. Eleanor relocated. Her life reduced to a stipend and a room in someone else's house. Protected on paper, but powerless in reality. This knowledge haunted him. Pride told him to keep trying the respectable path. Another proposal, another arrangement, another negotiation, but survival demanded something else entirely. He had lowered his standards again and again. Wealth, age, reputation, none of it mattered anymore. Still, the answer was always no. The clock was ticking louder now. Richard was aging. His health was no longer guaranteed. And Eleanor's future was shrinking by the day. The conflict inside him became unbearable. As a father, he wanted dignity for his daughter. As a realist, he knew dignity did not keep a woman fed or safe. Society had made its decision about Eleanor, and he could not undo it, not through money, not through status, not through reason. Every acceptable solution had collapsed. And in that vacuum, his mind began to move towards something he had never allowed himself to consider before. It was a thought that felt wrong the moment it surfaced. Dangerous, unforgivable, but it was also practical. It addressed the problem no one else would. Eleanor needed protection, not approval. Strength, not reputation. Loyalty that could not walk away when things became inconvenient. The idea horrified him. It challenged everything he believed about race, power, and order. And yet, once it took hold, he could not unsee it. When all respectable options fail, desperation has a way of making the unthinkable feel inevitable. When Colonel Whitmore finally spoke the words aloud, even he struggled to believe them. The solution he had reached was not just unconventional, it was unthinkable. In a society governed by rigid hierarchies, where race determined humanity and law enforced separation, he intended to entrust his white, disabled daughter's life to an enslaved black man, not as a servant, not as hired help, but as her protector, her constant companion, the person responsible for her safety when he was gone. In Virginia in 1856, this decision violated every social boundary at once. A white woman was meant to be protected by a white husband. An enslaved man was legally property, not a person capable of loyalty, judgment, or affection. Power flowed in one direction only. To reverse it, even partially, was to invite outrage, suspicion, and danger. What Colonel Whitmore was proposing did not fit into any legal or moral category his society recognized. And yet, in his mind, it solved the one problem no one else would face honestly: Eleanor's survival. The man he chose was named Josiah. Most people on the estate knew Josiah only by reputation. He was the blacksmith, enormous, silent, physically overwhelming. People called him the Brute, not because he was violent, but because they could not imagine a man of his size being anything else. He stood well over 7 feet tall, with shoulders shaped by years of hammering iron and arms powerful enough to bend metal into submission. Enslaved workers gave him space. White visitors stared, uneasy, half expecting menace where there was only restraint. To them, Josiah was strength without humanity, muscle without mind, useful, dangerous, and interchangeable. That image made the colonel's decision even more shocking. He was not choosing someone socially acceptable. He was choosing someone society feared. And yet, Richard Whitmore had watched Josiah for years. He had seen him work without complaint, endure punishment without cruelty, and move through the world with a quiet discipline that contradicted every stereotype attached to him. He had seen how Josiah handled tools with precision, how he avoided conflict, how he treated others with care, despite never being treated the same in return. Where others saw only a body, Richard had begun to see reliability. Still, the implications were staggering. Giving an enslaved man authority over a white woman, even a disabled one, was taboo. Allowing him access to her daily life, her private spaces, her vulnerability, was something society would call reckless, immoral, even dangerous. But Richard's thinking had moved beyond reputation. White men had been given every opportunity to protect Eleanor, and all of them had walked away. Respectable society had failed her completely. Josiah, bound by law and circumstance, would not. When Eleanor first heard the plan, disbelief turned quickly to fear. She had grown up hearing the same stories everyone else had, stories that stripped men like Josiah of complexity and painted them as threats. She knew his size. She knew his nickname. And she knew what society said about enslaved men and white women. The decision felt less like protection and more like being handed from one form of powerlessness to another. She was being treated like property to be assigned, not a person to be consulted. And yet, once the shock settled, the moral clarity became harder to ignore. This arrangement exposed an uncomfortable truth. Society trusted an unknown white man more than it trusted a known black one, regardless of character. Eleanor had been rejected not because she was unsafe, but because she was inconvenient. Josiah was feared not because he was cruel, but because he existed outside the lie society told itself about who deserved humanity. When Eleanor finally met Josiah face to face, the dissonance became undeniable. The man before her was immense, yes, but also careful. His voice was quiet. His eyes avoided hers not with hostility, but with practiced restraint. He did not act like someone asserting power. He acted like someone who had never been allowed to have it. And slowly, painfully, the image of the brute began to crack. This decision did not feel heroic. It felt dangerous. It raised questions with no clean answers. Was this protection or another form of control? Was it kindness or desperation dressed as strategy? Could two people stripped of agency by different systems find safety in each other, or would the weight of society crush them both? Nothing about this choice was comfortable. Nothing about it was simple. But it marked the moment when every illusion fell away. The rules Virginia lived by could not save Eleanor, and the man it called a brute might be the only one capable of seeing her as fully human. The first days after the decision were heavy with tension. Eleanor and Josiah occupied the same space, yet felt separated by everything society had taught them to fear. Eleanor saw his size before she saw anything else, the sheer physical presence of a man the world had warned her against. Josiah, in turn, saw a white woman of status and fragility, someone he had been conditioned to defer to without question. Neither of them had chosen this situation. Both understood how dangerous it could be. Silence filled the rooms they shared, not because there was nothing to say, but because saying anything felt risky. Their earliest conversations were stiff, formal, careful. Josiah spoke little, answering only what was asked, his posture trained by years of survival. Eleanor struggled with her own uncertainty. She had been labeled unmarriageable, given away in desperation, and now found herself dependent on a man society insisted she should fear. Yet beneath the fear, curiosity began to surface. Josiah did not behave like the monster she had imagined. He moved slowly around her, asked permission before helping, treated her body not as an inconvenience, but as something deserving care. His strength was obvious, but so was his restraint. What truly shifted everything was conversation. One evening, when formality gave way to exhaustion, Eleanor asked him a question that had nothing to do with duty. She asked what he read. The question startled him. Reading was forbiddance. Knowledge itself was dangerous for someone in his position. But when he answered honestly, something fragile opened between them. Josiah spoke about books he had found and hidden, words he had learned on his own, ideas that had kept him alive inside a world designed to erase his inner life. Eleanor listened not politely, not distantly, but with genuine interest. For the first time in years, Josiah was not being measured by his body alone. Eleanor responded in kind, sharing her own isolation. She spoke of being surrounded by wealth, yet cut off from the world. Of watching life move forward while she remained still. Of how people spoke to her more slowly once she was in a wheelchair, as if her mind had been injured along with her legs. In that exchange, something profound became clear to both of them. They were different in every way society recognized race, status, freedom, but they were alike in the way they had been reduced. He was seen only as muscle. She was seen only as limitation. Trust did not arrive suddenly. It grew in small moments. In the way Josiah asked before touching her chair. In the way Eleanor defended his intelligence when others dismissed it. In shared silences that no longer felt threatening. Over time, obligation softened into choice. Josiah was no longer just fulfilling an assignment. He was protecting someone who saw him as human. Eleanor was no longer merely enduring an arrangement. She was engaging with someone who saw her beyond her disability. Their conversations deepened. They spoke about books, about ideas, about lives neither of them were allowed to imagine openly. Josiah's thoughts were sharp, shaped by observation and loss. Eleanor's were refined but restless, hungry for purpose. Together, they created a space where curiosity replaced fear, where respect replaced assumption. The world outside still denied them agency, still defined them by labels neither had chosen. But inside those conversations, something new took root. This was the turning point. Not love yet, but recognition. The moment when two people society had discarded realized they were no longer alone in that experience. What began as a desperate arrangement slowly became something else entirely. Not imposed protection, but mutual regard. Not survival enforced by circumstance, but connection chosen in defiance of it. What grew between Eleanor and Josiah did not announce itself. It had to remain quiet, careful, almost invisible. In a world where even the appearance of impropriety could mean violence, their connection deepened in whispers and glances, in conversations that lingered longer than necessary, in the comfort of being understood without explanation. There was no grand declaration, no sudden crossing of a line. Instead, there was the steady realization that each of them felt more seen in the other's presence than they ever had before. For Eleanor, it was the first time someone looked at her without first looking at the wheelchair. Josiah listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, because to him they did. He asked her opinions, sought her judgment, respected her intelligence. He did not rush her, pity her, or try to manage her emotions. In his presence, she was not a burden to be tolerated, but a person to be valued. That recognition was intoxicating and also terrifying. She knew exactly how dangerous it was to feel this way. For Josiah, the danger was even clearer. He had spent his entire life learning how to disappear inside himself to survive. Loving a white woman, especially one he had been assigned to protect, was not just forbidden, it was lethal if discovered. Yet Eleanor treated him as an equal in the only ways available to her. She spoke to him openly. She trusted him. She defended his humanity in a world that denied it daily. In her eyes, he was not property or brute strength. He was a man whose thoughts, fears, and hopes mattered. Their intimacy was emotional long before it was anything else. It lived in shared books, in late-night conversations, and the way silence felt safe instead of oppressive. Each interaction carried risk. A servant might notice. A visitor might ask questions. A single rumor could unravel everything. They were walking a narrow edge between necessity and desire, knowing that discovery would force a reckoning neither of them was prepared for. When Colonel Whitmore finally discovered the truth, it was not through gossip, but accident. A moment of unguarded closeness, a look held too long, the kind of scene that needed no explanation. The confrontation that followed was sharp, immediate, and devastating. The arrangement he had created out of desperation had crossed into territory he had never intended to allow. What he saw before him was not protection, it was affection. And affection, in Virginia in 1856, was unforgivable. The tension that followed was unbearable. Eleanor stood at a moral crossroads she could not retreat from. She could deny what she felt, destroy the relationship, and return to a life of quiet safety defined by other people's rules. Or she could speak the truth and risk everything: her reputation, her security, and Josiah's life. For the first time, the decision was not about survival alone. It was about dignity. What followed was not just a father's anger, but a reckoning with the rules he had lived by all his life. The same rules that had declared his daughter unmarriageable. The same rules that had stripped Josiah of humanity. Now those rules demanded sacrifice. Someone had to be broken for order to be restored. And the question hanging in the air was simple, brutal, and unavoidable. Would he destroy the bond that had given his daughter life, or destroy the system that said it should never have existed at all? The end of Eleanor and Josiah's story did not come gently, and it did not come without cost. There was no version of this choice where everyone walked away unscarred. When Colonel Whitmore finally made his decision, it was not driven by sentiment, but by truth. He had spent years trying to protect his daughter by obeying society's rules, and those rules had failed her completely. Now he faced a final reckoning. Preserve order and destroy the one thing that had given Eleanor a full life, or break from everything he had been taught and accept the consequences. His choice came with loss, reputation, standing, the quiet approval of his peers. To free Josiah and send both of them away meant admitting that the world he lived in was unjust, not only to enslaved men, but to his own child. It meant acknowledging that love, dignity, and worth did not belong exclusively to those society had chosen to favor. Virginia could not allow what Eleanor and Josiah had become together, so they left it behind. Not triumphantly, not without fear, but deliberately. They crossed from a place that labeled people into a place where they could begin again. Freedom changed them both, but not in the way society would have predicted. Eleanor did not become someone new. She became more fully herself. Without the constant weight of being called unmarriageable, she stepped into the abilities that had always been there. Her mind, once dismissed, became essential. Her voice, once ignored, carried authority. She was no longer defined by what she could not do, but by what she built, nurtured, and led. Disability did not disappear, but shame did. And Josiah, once stripped of identity and reduced to labor, became what he had always been denied the right to be, a man recognized for his skill, his intellect, and his devotion. Freedom did not make him gentle. He already was. It made that gentleness visible. It allowed his strength to be seen not as threat, but as care. Not as danger, but as protection chosen, not enforced. Their life together was not untouched by hardship. Prejudice did not vanish when they crossed borders. Acceptance was never universal. But what they gained was something Virginia had refused them both: the right to define themselves. To be seen not as problems to be managed, but as people capable of love, partnership, and dignity. And that is the question this story leaves us with. Who truly decides a person's worth? Is it law? Custom? Fear disguised as tradition? Or is worth something that exists regardless of whether society is willing to acknowledge it? Eleanor was called unmarriageable because she did not fit the shape the world demanded. Josiah was called a brute because the world refused to see his humanity. In the end, neither label survived the truth of who they were. History often tells us it is shaped by battles, by legislation, by powerful men making public decisions. But just as often, it is shaped quietly by individuals who choose love over fear, dignity over approval, and humanity over rules that were never just to begin with. Eleanor and Josiah did not change the world overnight, but they changed each other. And sometimes, that is how history truly moves forward.